Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I am Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about functions, which is part 2 of our two-part series on functions in JavaScript. So let's continue on. In part 2 of our series on functions, we'll look even deeper into what we can do with our functions. We can declare functions that require additional information in order to perform their tasks. Functions that require additional information, when they're called, we pass parameters or arguments to when the function is invoked. So in other words, when we call the name of the function, we actually pass in some parameters or arguments to that function. The parameters that we pass into the function act like variables as they are passed into the function and then used inside the statements of the function itself. So here's a typical function structure, and we talked about this in the previous tutorial. First we have the function keyword. Then we have the function name, and that's any name that we want. We give it whatever name we need for that particular function. Normally the name describes something that the function's performing inside the statements. Then we can pass in parameters inside those parentheses. In this particular example, I'm passing in 2. But you can pass in about as many parameters as you want. I mean, I've actually passed in, I want to say, I think the most I've ever passed into a function was I passed in a full array set, which was probably 30, 35 different parameters into a function so that it could process it. And then what we do is we actually have a return value that's going to return the sum. In this particular case, it's the sum of the number 1 and number 2. It's going to return that back outside of our function that we can use that again inside of our application. So that's a basic function structure that we looked at not only in the previous tutorial but also in this tutorial. And we're going to practice all this in the lab. When you call a function that has parameters, you specify the values that it should use in the parentheses that follow the name of the function. The values are called arguments, and they can be provided as values or as variables. It's not unusual to pass these arguments as variables to the function. In fact, that is the case more often than not, that we actually will pass in variables to the function and not values. Because normally we're pulling something out of the application, and we're going to work with that and then pass it back to the application. So we can get multiple values from a function by using an array, and I'll demonstrate that in the lab. Because looking at the return value, it looks like you can only return one value from the function itself, but that's not quite true. What we can actually do is we can actually build an array inside the function as we're getting multiple values. Then we pass the array out, and then the application can break the array down and use the values that are inside that array. And I know you haven't studied arrays yet. We're actually going to do that probably in a couple of tutorials. But arrays are basically variables that store multiple values inside the variable name, inside the name of the array. And again, we'll study those in a couple of tutorials, but they are quite useful in programming. In fact, we use them probably as much as we use variables. So let's move into our development environment and discuss what we talked in our presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and drop out of our presentation and drop into our development environment. First thing I want to do, let's go ahead and confirm we got our Apache server up and running, which we do. By the way, I get a lot of emails asking why I confirm the server is up and running at the start of most of my tutorials. And the reason being is when you're working with things like JavaScript and PHP, if your server is not running, a lot of the stuff will not operate, will not function correctly. And you would be surprised at how many emails I get from people telling me that things aren't operating correctly. And when I do a connection with them, because I'll actually go online with some people and actually work with them live, they don't have their development environment running. So that's why I always confirm that it's up, if anyone's curious. I'm going to go ahead and load Sublime Text 3, which will be the text editor I'll be using for this demonstration, and Google Chrome will be my browser. We're going to go into the extended part 2 of the functions inside of JavaScript. And the first thing I'm going to take this template.html file. I'm going to do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this. And I'm going to save this as functions_3.html so that we don't overwrite the demonstrations from the first tutorial. And let's go ahead and start a new set. First thing I'm going to do, let's go ahead and give us our h3 heading inside of our file. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that from my exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. Now I want to go in and make sure we've got the right one loaded. And we do. So now we can actually move ahead with this process. Now I'm actually going to create this function that's actually going to require these parameters. I do want you to be aware I'm doing this. And I'm actually going to generate it with an error, and I want you to see why. So, because we've talked about the placement of HTML and JavaScript code and how important it is where you place things inside your document. So I'm just giving you a heads up that I'm going to put this in a bad location just so you can see how these can impact your applications. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I am going to type this because I want you to get a hang of how these functions work. So I'm going to open up my script tags, and I want you to get used to following along. That's how you're going to learn this best. And inside the script, I'm going to generate a function. And my function, let me go ahead and indent this. My function is going to be called CAL areas because I want to calculate an area. And inside my parentheses, I'm actually going to require two parameters. I want a width and I want a height. And then I'm going to open up my curly braces. Now I'm going to perform a couple of statements inside here. First, I'm going to create a variable called area. And the area is going to be equal to the width times the height. And we've talked about these operators in an earlier tutorial. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say return area. So what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the variable that I created in the previous statement and I'm returning it back to whatever called the function inside my application or inside my HTML document. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Great time to pause if you want to type this in. You'll notice we have nothing in our browser yet, and the reason being is because basically we've created a function but we haven't done anything with it. So now let's go into our browser window right underneath our heading tag, and let's go ahead and create the code that will actually generate or call this function, have it calculate something, and bring it into our document. So again, because it's JavaScript, I got to open up my script tags. So I'm going to come down, let's go ahead and close that tag. And the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and call the function itself. So I'm going to create a variable called area1, and area1 is going to be equal to CAL area, and then inside my parentheses I'm going to put 3, 10. So I'm passing it two parameters. I'm going to end that with a semicolon like we end all of our statements in JavaScript. So I've created a variable called area1, and that variable is going to be equal to the calculated area of 3, 10. In other words, the two values I'm passing in to my function. That's how we pass those variables or those values in. Now, in order to display this, I got to do document.write because we've actually gone through this exercise a few times, and I want to write area1 onto my screen. And then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. All I'm doing here is I'm taking the value that I've got stored in area1 and I'm displaying it on the screen inside my browser window. And we've used document.write before, so I mean you should understand pretty well how that works. Let's go ahead and save all these changes, refresh our browser window, and you'll notice we have nothing displayed in the browser window. And like I told you when we started out with this tutorial, I was actually going to generate an error on this intentionally. We're actually calling a function here. Let me go into our developers tools and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to bring up the developers tools inside Google Chrome. And you'll notice, let me go ahead and open this up. Looking at the console log, it's telling me uncaught reference error. Cal area is not defined. I'm actually calling a function inside my HTML that doesn't exist. Because I'm actually calling this function, and you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, yeah, sure it exists because we've actually created it right here. The problem is I'm actually calling it before I create it. And that's why JavaScript placement inside your files is so important. If I were to take this, I'm going to do a Control X on the PC, Command X on the Mac to cut that out of that location and put this in the head section of my document. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it into the head, Control V on the PC, Command V on the Mac. Clean up my formatting, save the change, refresh my browser window. Now you'll notice my error is gone, and also I've got the response back. You'll notice I've got 30 here inside my browser window. And the reason being is because I've actually figured out the calculation. It's taken the values of 3 and 10 and it's multiplied the width by the height and returned that area to me. I've taken that area returned, put it in that variable, and then I've displayed the variable on my screen. So it's actually displayed it. I can't overemphasize as you're going through this training how important it is to understand the placement of your code and to read through your code and logically think through what's occurring. If by yourself, before I actually showed you the solution to that problem, if you caught the fact that I was calling this function before it was actually created, you are way ahead of the game. You actually think very structurally, and if you think structurally, you are going to be a phenomenal programmer. That was the hardest thing for me to grasp as I was learning programming, is I had to think structurally. I had to think very sequentially as I was developing my code. And it takes a while as a developer, as a programmer, to get used to thinking that way as you're writing code. You want to get into the mindset that you're thinking structurally, that as each line occurs, what's there, what's occurred, what hasn't occurred. And as I called this function, when I actually set this up and called the function, I had not created the function yet. And that's why it generated that error that you saw in the developer's tools. Now, and again, as a true developer, I would have never put this in here like this anyway. I would have done what we had done in the previous tutorial, and that was including that inside the external file, which is what we're going to do next. And that's how you should be thinking. Keep your scripts, keep your functions in an external file, call that file. This way they're always available as you need them. So let's do that next. Let's make this part of our helper functions. All right, so let's carry this one step further. I'm going to go ahead and open up that JavaScript file that we created earlier, that helper.js file that we created. I'm going to go back to my functions _3. I'm going to take this function that we created, I'm going to cut it, Control X on the PC, Command X on the Mac, go into my helper functions, and right below where I created my second function, I'm going to paste it, Control V on the PC, Command V on the Mac, and I'm going to bring this in here. Let's go ahead and clean up my formatting just a little bit. Save those changes, and now this has become part of my helper.js file. One thing I will point out that normally when I'm doing these, I'll actually put comments above these to let each group know what these are doing. Like this calculates the area of dimensions. So we'll just say it calculates the area of a wall, because that's normally what you would use this for. The width times the height. Or if I did the length times the width, that would calculate the area of a floor. Either way, but it's calculating the area. And I normally do put comments above these functions because most of my helper.js files or my helper PHP files, they're huge. I mean, they may have 200 or 300 different functions in them. And I'll use these on a lot of different websites. So I'll actually create a helper function. You can turn on my word wrap. I'll actually create a helper function file, and I may use that same file on a bunch of different websites and just go in and clean up things that I'm not using for that particular site. But there are some functions that I'll use on every site, like data preparation as I write it into a database, or encryption as I encrypt passwords. That stuff is pretty much consistent across all my sites or all the sites that I design, because for instance, as the encryption methods change for passwords, as they become more and more strengthened with the way in which we encrypt, I just go update that function, and then I can put that to all my sites. And I get the new encryption methods very, very easily by just copying that helper file over. Anyway, got a little off track there. Let's go ahead and save that change. Now, the first thing we need to do in order to make this work here is we actually have to bring that script in. So I just got to basically say here, src equal, and then inside parentheses, I put in my _JS, my /, and then my helper.js file. And then I close out my script tag. And now I've got, let me go ahead and pull that out. Now I've actually brought in that file into this function _3.html file. So now I should actually still get my response back, because even though the code's no longer inside the file itself, I'm still calling that helper.js. What's really cool about having functions, and let me show you what I mean by this. What if I wanted to do this? What if I say, okay, create a variable area2, and that's going to be equal to, and again, I'm going to call that same function, but this time, let's say that it's 10 by 1 by 15. So I've got different dimensions, and then I'm just going to say document.write, and then in here I'll say area2. So I'm using basically the same code that we've just created, but now I've got two different responses. And I actually may want to put a break in there, but you'll get the gist. Let's go ahead and save the change, and you'll see now that we have two responses using that same code. I've got my first one that's 30 feet, or 30, a value of 30, and I've got the next one which is 150. So I'm just reusing that same function and just passing it different values. And we can do that throughout. I mean, I could pass that 150 different values or 200 different values to calculate, and it would just continue to calculate based on the values that I pass in with those parameters. Now let's look at how we can get multiple values out of a function. All right, so let's go into our next demonstration. I want to actually show you how you can get multiple values out of a function. And again, keep in mind that we're going to be going through functions many times as we go through these tutorials, because as we build on your JavaScript knowledge, we'll be using functions a lot to actually do that. So you're going to see many demonstrations of functions as we go through the training. I just want to give you an overall grasp of how functions work and how we actually structure them. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, let's go ahead and save this file so I don't overwrite your file. I want to save this as function_for.html. And then I want to go ahead and remove all of our code from this. Save the file. And the first thing I want to do is I actually want to use this as an external file. So I'm going to go into my helper.js file that we just modified a little earlier. And I'm actually going to create this function in that file. So I'm going to go ahead and first thing I'm going to do is put in my note, because I do want to use a note, because I tend to use notes when I create my helper functions. This is going to calculate the area and volume of a cube. So we're actually going to have 3 different inputs into this, and we're actually going to have to create an array to store the 2 different outputs, because I not only do I want to get the area of the cube, but I actually want to get the volume of the cube at the same time. So let me show you how we do this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my function. So I'm going to type my function keyword, and then I'm going to give my function a name. It's going to be getSize, and I'm using camel case. And this function is going to require 3 values or 3 parameters, 3 arguments to actually calculate all this. I'm going to need a width and a height and a depth. And I'm just going to use WHD because I can name these anything I want as they go into these arguments. So I'm just, to keep it simple, I'm going to just make it WHD for width, height, and depth. Now, because I'm doing this and I'm not being very descriptive inside these argument names, normally inside my notes, I would actually put in here what those stood for, or I'd actually give them more of a descriptive name. But because we're doing this as a demonstration, I want you to understand you can name them anything you want. I'm just going to use WHD. Then I'm going to open and close my curly braces. And now let's go ahead and build the actual function. And this function needs to do a couple things. First thing I want to calculate the area. And we know how to do that because we actually did that in our last demonstration. So I'm going to create a variable called area. And that is going to be equal to the width times the height. And then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Then I actually want to create the volume, or I want to calculate the volume of this cube. So I need another variable, and I'm going to call it volume. And that is going to be equal to the width times the height, and then times the depth. So now I have 3 calculations, but I actually have 2 returns also, because now I've got a variable that's area, which is width and height, and a variable that's volume, which is width, height, and depth. So now what I need to do in order to get both of those, I need to create another variable and call it sizes. And again, I could name this whatever I want, but sizes is very descriptive. And this variable is going to be equal to an array. And I'm going to actually create the array in these square braces. And once we cover arrays again, you're going to understand much more about how these work. Just take my word for it. This is actually an array. It's going to store a group of variables. I'm going to type in area is the first one I want it to store, and volume is the second one I want it to store. And I could store many more. I'm just storing those 2 because those are the 2 we currently have with this particular function. And then what I want to do is I want to return sizes. So I'm going to return sizes to the calling area, or to the calling script or calling function that never called this function from our HTML document or from our web application. So that's our complete function. We created a function called getSizes. I'm going to pass in 3 parameters. I'm going to do a few calculations. Then I'm going to build an array called sizes and pass out those responses, the area and volume, back to the calling statement inside my application, web application or web page. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Now let's go back to function_for.html to actually create what we need inside this document to call those returns. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and build the interface that's actually going to call the returns from that function we just created in our helper.js file. Keep in mind, we actually still have the line that's connecting that helper.js file to the function_for.html document. We have to have that in there in order to call that function. So inside our container, the first thing I'm going to do is put my h3 heading. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this from the exercise file so you don't have to watch me type it. And that heading is going to be basically what we've been doing all along. calculate the area of a cube. So I just gave myself a nice little H3 heading. And then I'm actually going to put some paragraph text in here also. And again, I'm doing this so that you can remember what we're doing with this calculation. I want to calculate the area, width and height, and the volume of the cube, which is width, height, and depth. So I'm going to need 3 parameters as I go through here. And now what I want to do is I actually want to create the script that's going to do that. This is a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up my script tags, because I'm going to do this one a little bit differently than we did the other one. And again, I'm doing this again just so that you can see that there is a lot of different ways to do these things. The first thing I'm going to do inside my script tag is I'm going to create a variable, and that variable is going to be called width. And that is going to be equal to, for the sake of this demonstration, we'll just say 15. I'm going to create another variable, and it's going to be called height. And that will just say, for the sake of the argument, it's going to be 10. And then I'm going to create another variable, and it's going to be called depth. And for this particular demonstration, that'll be 12. So I've created 3 variables which are going to hold the parameters for my function call. And then I'm going to come down and create another variable, and I'm going to call this area. And the area is going to be equal to, now I want to call my function, get size, and I'm going to say width, comma height, comma depth. So what I'm doing is I'm calling the values that are from these variables. And you'll see why I did this in a minute, because this actually gives you a lot more opportunities. But now what I want you to remember, since we want the area, I want you to go back and look at this function. Area is the first location in our array. Arrays are zero-based, as you're going to learn when we cover arrays. And because we've actually touched them now for a couple times, I think arrays are the next thing I'm going to do in the tutorials, just so that you get a handle on how they work. But arrays are zero-based, so area is the first one. So what I want to do to get my area, I actually want to call the location of 0 at that size array. So when it returns, it's going to return sizes to me. I want to say, okay, sizes go to 0 and give me that value. And that's what we're doing right here. I'm saying area is going to be equal to get size. Those are my calculations, and I want you to return the value as 0 to me. Now for volume, you could create another variable called volume, and that is going to be equal to get size. And again, same thing. I want to pass in the width, the height, and the depth. But this one is actually going to be at location 1, because now I want to grab this guy. I want to grab the volume. We know if this is 0, then this is 1, because it's 0, 1, 2, 3. There's zero-based counting. So here I'm going to say, okay, go grab the value that's currently in location 1 of that sizes array, and that will give me the volume. And then again, in order to get these to display on the screen, I'm going to say document.write. And then in my parentheses, the first one I want to see is area. And then I'm going to add my concatenate symbol. And then inside my quotation marks, I'm going to put a break tag so we actually get a line feed. And it takes us down to the next line. And then I'm just going to copy this line, Control C in the PC, Command C in the Mac. Come right below it. I'm going to paste in Control V on the PC, Command V on the Mac. And this one I actually want to be the volume. So now I'm going to get to see the volume and the area based on the returns from the get size array. So let's go ahead and save all those changes. This would be a great time to pause if you want to type this in. I'm going to refresh my browser window, and you'll notice now, let's go ahead and make sure we got 4 up. I got 1500 is the area and 1800 is the volume. And the beauty here, by the way that we've designed this, all I have to do is modify a variable and it's going to recalculate those. Let's say that I made the width 10 and I made the height 10 and I made the depth 10. So I have a perfect square. Let's go ahead and save those changes. When I refresh my browser window, everything is going to recalculate based on those new values. That's the beauty of using functions and the beauty of using variables as our arguments, because I can actually just change the value of the variables, save those changes, recalculate or reload my page, and I get brand new values based on those new variable values. Again, there is a lot of power in using functions. There's a lot of power in using variables for our function parameters. And we're going to go through this many, many times through the course of this training. I just want you to have a grasp of how functions work, that functions are reusable code that we can use throughout our applications. I could call this get size or this calc area anywhere in my application, and they would work just fine. If I wanted to calculate an area, I could just go back and calculate the area of and I could reuse those variables. And these variables can be named whatever we want. I could have these variables W, HE, and DE. The only thing I'd have to do is I'd have to modify it here, W, HE, and DE. W, HE, and DE. They can be whatever names that you want, as long as I refer to them in my parameters, it matches the names I'm using in the variables. And again, they don't have to match the names I'm using in the function, because the function doesn't care. As soon as I pass over this W inside the get size, it becomes W here, regardless of what I pass it in as. When I passed over this HE for height, as soon as it hits the function, it becomes H here, because that's what I'm passing it in as. So if I save those changes, refresh my browser window, it's going to have no impact on my values, because again, I can name those anything I want. So I hope you've got an understanding or basic knowledge of how functions work inside of JavaScript. We're going to use a ton of them. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me either through the site or through email on the site. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.